We've all been wronged. We've all been taken advantage of, and we've all been treated unfairly, sometimes very unfairly. I told my kids when they were young, and now I tell my grandkids, what I call the first rule of life. Life is not fair. Deal with it. So how does a Christian react to being taken advantage of or being lied to? And the answer to that is Jesus gave us in Matthew 6:12. And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Well, imagine a friend of yours comes up to you, says, had a little car problem. Could I borrow $100 till I get my check on Friday? So you loan them the $100. They're officially now a debtor, right? They owe you money. But then Friday comes along, and they come up, they get their check, and they give you the $100 back. Well, what Jesus is talking about here when we forgive our debtors is when someone doesn't pay you back. And that $100 is gone for good. He says we still have to forget them. So why is forgiveness so very important? And the answer to that is we help ourselves by forgiving others. We help ourselves by forgiving others. Remember when Jesus forgave the woman that was caught in the act of adultery. Now, Jesus knew her heart because he is God. He could tell that she had repented. What about us? We don't know someone's heart. We can't tell if someone really repented or not. Some people are really good actors, and they could fool just about anyone. A lot of the Oscar and Emmy Award winners or people recommended for those awards are really good. They could change character immediately, no problem at all, and you couldn't believe that they were acting. So how do we know? Well, Jesus told us in Matthew 7:20, therefore, by their fruits, you will know them. And that's the key. Now, this was specifically speaking about false teachers, but it applies to everything. We don't know someone's heart, but we can see the fruits. That is the important concept here. So, by their fruits, we can see if they're really repentant or not. Example of looking at fruits is John Mark and his relationship with the Apostle Paul. And it's also an example of Christian conflict in the context of forgiveness. John Mark was included in the missionary journey. Reading from Acts 12:25, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry, and they also took with them John, whose surname was Mark. So John Mark goes along. They feel he would be a good contributor. Things didn't go that well because he left midstream. In Acts 13:13, now when Paul and his party set sail from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John departed from them, returning to Jerusalem. Now, we don't know why John left, what was so important to him, and some people have speculated, but it really doesn't matter. There's two things that we do know. We know that John left because it tells us in Acts 13:13. But we also know, the second point, we also know that Paul was not really happy about that. In fact, he was very unhappy, and whatever excuse John Mark had, he wasn't buying it. And we know that from Acts 15:36. Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John called Mark, but Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from him in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. So what we have here is Paul looked at the fruits, didn't see them, and didn't want John Mark with him. Barnabas interpreted it differently and took John Mark. So what happens later on? What we see later on is that Paul did look at the fruits of John Mark and his ministry. And towards the end of Paul's recorded ministry, in 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul says, "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry." Okay, well, what happened? Paul looked at the fruits that John Mark produced. He totally forgave him because he saw positive fruits. And then John Mark became an important person in Paul's ministry. So Paul completely forgave him and wanted him near so he could work with him in the future. Now, this sets the example for us. When someone wrongs us or lets us down, we don't know the heart. And so we can't make judgments based on our feeling of the heart. But we can make judgments based on the fruit. If we see the fruits are there, as Jesus said, therefore by their fruits you will know them, we could see if that person, as we forgive them, we can subsequently rely on them. If the fruits are good, like in Mark's case, he can be completely forgiven. The infraction is history, and it's not to be brought up in the future. But what happens when the fruits are not good? Let me give you an example from my personal life. When I worked at Argonne National Lab, my job was to be a project manager, and I had to write research proposals. So I submitted a proposal to the Advanced Concepts Committee. The members on that committee liked the proposal, except for one individual who was vehemently opposed to it and was in a relatively high position, several layers of management higher than my position. So he rejected it, and it was rejected. The next year, that very same individual submitted my proposal and got a significant amount of funding based on my idea. And he then, while I was around, bragged about how his proposal got funding. Well, I think we can call that bad fruits. Of course, he never mentioned me, but definitely bad fruits. Well, how do we handle that kind of situation? Which gets back to the title, forgiveness, repentance, fruits, in this case bad, and now cheek. Because Jesus tells us how to handle this in Matthew 5:39. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now, this doesn't mean you should become a punching bag. And it doesn't mean that you should deny the faith because of someone else. But what it does mean in this circumstance is that you have to let it go. You have to let that debt go. You have to forgive it because you have to move on. You cannot dwell on that. I cannot dwell on this individual because he's not mad at me. He's not hurt at all. He's happy. He's bragging. I'm the one who is hurt. And if I keep dwelling on it, what happens, and Paul tells us what happens in Hebrews 12:15, looking carefully, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. So what happens to me if I kept focusing on this? I get a root of bitterness. I become defiled. I'm the one hurt. He's happy. He's not affected at all. I'm only hurting myself now, doing double damage. So turning the other cheek means letting go. And the reason why is to avoid a root of bitterness, because the bitterness only hurts us when we become bitter. The person who wronged you, he doesn't care. He or she doesn't care about you and probably will forget the whole incident. But you were the one that wronged. But by turning the other cheek and letting it go, you will not become bitter. That doesn't mean you trust that individual again in the future. But it does mean that you have let it go and there's no chance for any bitterness to establish itself in your heart. And that is the critical concept. Interestingly, by chance, after we were both retired for many years, I happened to meet this individual in a restaurant. And he was friendly, like we were old buddies. And I was just very cordial to him because the incident was over. It was years ago. I had let it go. As I said, I wouldn't trust him for anything in the future because he didn't have the fruits. But it's over. You let it go, and there's no more bitterness. The key here is that we have to look for the fruits. That is critical. Whatever happened in the past, if that person now has good fruits, it's over. And you can work with that person. If the person has bad fruits, then you just let it go, turn the other cheek, and don't become bitter, because you don't hurt yourself by being bitter. Vengeance is God's, not ours. And so how you see how the title all goes together. We have to forgive other people, as what's commonly called the Lord's Prayer tells us. There has to be repentance, and we can tell repentance by the fruits. And if the fruits are good, then there's certainly repentance. If the fruits are bad, we turn the other cheek, we let it go, and we make sure that we don't become bitter, because we help ourselves by forgiving.